All right, ready to dive into some really interesting stuff today.
Yeah, bring it on.
So you've sent us this paper, right? How we classify countries and people and why it matters.
Hmm.
And let me tell you, it is
It's a big one.
it's a doozy. It really is. Just reading it, I don't know if you ever get this like weird feeling where you hear like developed versus developing countries.
Yeah.
Like it's this ranking system.
Oh, totally. It's like, yeah, it's more than just semantics, right? There's a lot, and I think that's what's so fascinating about this deep dive. It goes right to the heart of how language, especially when we're talking about global issues, can be so rooted, like we're just talking about, in colonialism, like way back in the day, but how that can still reinforce power dynamics today that we don't even realize.
Absolutely. And it's like these terms we throw around all the time, every day, like even rich versus poor nations, global north versus global south,
Right?
even things like beneficiaries, donors.
Totally.
And this paper saying, all of these carry all this baggage from colonial times.
Yeah, like we're so used to them that we don't even question those power dynamics, right?
Totally.
Like one that comes to mind is third world, right?
Yeah.
You don't hear that as much anymore.
I don't hear as much anymore.
Which, thank goodness, but it really illustrates that, it puts it in a hierarchy, right?
It's like, oh, you're in the third world, you're behind.
Right, exactly.
Yikes.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting what you're saying about how even those, what seem to be more neutral terms like global south, can still carry that same baggage, especially when you tie it to this idea of aid, where there's a giver and a receiver.
Yes.
It just automatically puts this imbalance in there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because it's not like these inequalities don't exist.
Right.
I mean, there are real differences in wealth and resources and opportunities around the world. So how do you talk about those differences without, again, falling back on these kind of, potentially problematic labels?
That's the question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like you want to be able to acknowledge realities on the ground, but you don't want to use language that perpetuates the problem. So what's the solution? Does the paper offer any solutions?
It does. It does. And one of them is surprisingly simple. It's just to be more specific. So instead of relying on these broad categories like developing countries, which, that encompasses so much, and okay, well, let's talk about Southeast Asia or East Africa or Central America. And it seems like a small change, but I think by being more geographically specific, it kind of dismantles that us versus them.
Right.
That's so ingrained, at least, for us.
Okay, I see how that can shift the perspective just a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's about being more mindful,
Mm-hmm.
more precise with the language we're using.
Yeah.
But they also go a step further, don't they? They talk about using this term walled world.
Yes.
And I have to say, I found that term so powerful when I was reading this.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's brilliant because it goes beyond just physical borders and immigration policies, although those are definitely part of it. But it makes you think about all these other barriers that exist to resources, knowledge, opportunities. And it's a stark reminder that even though we live in a globally interconnected world, we still have these deep, deep divisions.
Yeah, and it's not just about changing the label. It's about actually looking at what are the systems and the structures that are creating these walled worlds, right?
Exactly.
And one of the things I was reading about is how they use malaria research as an example.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example because it kind of showcases how, our assumptions, right? So we automatically associate expertise with the global north or developed countries. But the thing is, African institutions have a wealth of knowledge and experience when it comes to combating malaria. But yet the majority of the funding still goes to institutions in high-income countries.
Right.
So it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy based on these outdated labels.
It's like we're clinging to these categories that no longer, if they ever really did, represent what's happening on the ground. So if we start to let go of some of these labels, what's next? Like, how do we talk about this stuff? How do we talk about global health and development in a way that is both accurate but also respectful?
Well, it's interesting. The paper talks about Hans Rosling, who, I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
Yeah, he's one who did all those data visualizations about global trends.
Yeah, and, he was a big proponent of moving beyond just rich and poor.
Right.
And he talked about 4 income levels as a way to look at global development.
Gotcha.
So it's a bit more nuanced, right? Because it recognizes that progress is happening,
Right.
but it's not evenly distributed.
That's a really great point because I can see how that At least, visually, when you're seeing it represented that way, it encourages a less binary way of thinking about it.
Totally.
But I have to say, even with that, it still feels like we're, I don't know, relying on these predefined boxes. Like, what if we could hit the reset button?
What if we could come up with entirely new
Yeah.
terms? Like, that would be a game changer.
What if we just stopped trying to tweak the old language and actually created a whole new vocabulary
Wow.
for talking about these issues that ditches the colonial baggage,
Totally.
that emphasizes collaboration, our shared humanity? Like, that's a paradigm shift.
I love that.
Right.
Like, completely rethinking it.
Yeah.
I mean, it would be a huge undertaking.
It would be huge.
But can you imagine, like, the possibilities there?
It's exciting to think about.
Right. Like, we could create language that reflects a more interconnected and equitable world.
Yes.
Instead of constantly, reinforcing the old power structures.
Totally. Like, even just instead of beneficiaries and donors, which again implies that power dynamic, what if it was partners
Yes.
or co-creators? It changes the whole, the narrative
Completely.
from a handout to a journey that you're on together.
Totally. And it shifts the focus from just, providing aid to actually fostering mutual learning and empowering communities to define their own solutions.
Right.
Which at the end of the day is what's going to lead to sustainable change.
Absolutely. You know what this whole conversation makes me think about? That George Orwell quote.
What's that?
If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought.
Oh, yeah.
And it just makes you realize how powerful language is.
Mm-hmm.
These labels we use, even the seemingly harmless ones, can really shape our entire worldview.
It's true, and it makes you realize how important it is to be a critical consumer of information.
Yes.
We need to constantly be questioning our assumptions and be mindful of the language that's being used around us, what we read in the news, what we hear in casual conversation. It all has an impact.
Absolutely. And so
Yeah.
bringing this back to you, what can you do?
Yeah.
It can feel kind of overwhelming to think about, oh my gosh, how do we change the way we talk about this?
You're right. It's not like you're going to single-handedly change the world's vocabulary overnight.
Right.
But I think it starts with awareness. So once you understand, the historical baggage and the implicit biases that are hidden within these terms that we use all the time,
Right.
then you can start to at least use them more consciously.
Sure.
Or better yet, replace them with more nuanced and respectful alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, it's about making that conscious effort, I think one conversation at a time.
It's funny. It's like the saying, think globally, act locally. But in this case, it's like, think critically, speak mindfully.
Oh, I like that.
Right.
Think critically, speak mindfully.
Yeah.
That's a good mantra.
And, it's not about being politically correct or
Right.
anything like that.
Yeah.
It's about actually recognizing that there's agency and expertise
Mm-hmm.
everywhere in
Yeah.
every corner of the world, not just in the places that we've decided are,
Right.
developed or advanced.
Exactly. It's about approaching these global issues with a sense of humility and a willingness to learn from different perspectives.
Yes.
Because, the truth is, nobody has all the answers.
Right.
And true progress requires collaboration and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
This whole conversation for me, I have to say, has been a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
It's like, I've always known that these labels felt a little, off, but I'm seeing them in a whole new light.
Right.
It's not just words, they carry so much weight.
That's really deep.
It reflects these really deep, power dynamics that I think we all need to be working to kind of dismantle.
Yeah, absolutely. And language is just one piece of that puzzle, right?
Right.
But it's a crucial one because, the words we choose shape the way we think.
Right.
And the way we think shapes the world that we create.
So where does that leave you? What can you do?
Hmm.
Now that we've had this conversation, what can you do with this new awareness as you navigate all this stuff?
Honestly, just by listening to this deep dive, you're already a step ahead, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking critically about these labels. You're questioning their impact.
Right.
So it's about, taking that awareness with you into your everyday conversations, right?
Yeah.
Being the one in the room to say, hey, maybe there's a more, accurate and respectful way to talk about this. Maybe we can start a ripple effect, right?
And who knows, maybe by having these conversations,
Yeah.
we can start to imagine this whole new vocabulary
I love it.
that is more inclusive, that is more representative of the world we actually live in,
Absolutely.
that creates more collaboration and understanding.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's a great note to end on. Well, this has been great.
It has.
Really appreciate it. Some food for thought.
Lots of food for thought.
Right. Just because we're used to using a word
Right.
doesn't mean it's the right word to use.
We can do better.
We can all do better.
Mm.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a great deep dive, and let's all think critically, speak mindfully, and keep pushing for that more equitable and just world.
Yes.
One conversation at a time.